Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Jonny Coker. Today we'll be talking about New Mexico's most important resource, water. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, nearly the entire state is experiencing some level of drought conditions. To talk with me today about these conditions and what's being done to preserve the resource is Dr. Phil King, Engineering Advisor for the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. Dr. King, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Jonny.
So essentially, just to start off the interview, how important is this issue to the average New Mexican? How much should people really be paying attention to this?
Well, I think it's extremely important. It is basically our limiting resource throughout the state. And a lot of people assume that their utility or their irrigation district will take care of it. But it really does take individual involvement to be sure that we do this in an effective and equitable way.
And water is, I mean, it's somewhat of an unseen resource in terms of like people just turn on their taps and it always works. But obviously it's a limited resource. I mean, what is your message to folks that feel that it's unlimited essentially?
Well, we have people around the state who are unfortunately finding out the hard way that it is not unlimited. Some of the communities over on the east side of the state drawing water from the Ogallala are flat running out, and it shouldn't come to that point. People need to understand the source of their water and the limitations of it and take action long before we get to that point.
And speaking of taking action, I mean, you told me in a previous conversation that failing to address changes in our water supply would be a dereliction of duty. Can you expand on what you meant by that?
Right. Well, we have several agencies and people charged with managing and planning for our water resources, our water resource future. And they are doing their level best to address this, but any effort to manage our water is dependent on buy-in, cooperation, contribution from all the way down from utilities to individual water users.
And so, another thing you mentioned to me in previous conversations were some studies, outlining what's being done in terms of preserving water. Can you give me, can you provide insights to the key findings in that leap ahead analysis regarding the impact of climate change on our state's water supply?
Certainly. The leap ahead analysis, as we call it, was basically a summary of the state of knowledge on climate change impacts on New Mexico's water future, particularly looking up to 2070. And they brought together some of the very best scientists and engineers in the field to produce this report. And it's a very frank and unfortunately bleak report where we're seeing the warming climate leading to general decline in stream runoff and aquifer recharge, which throws our systems, if they were in balance before, it throws them out of balance. If they were out of balance before, now they're critically out of balance. And so it's a wake-up call.
Definitely. And you talk about that balance. I mean, how important is it to the balance of the ecosystem to make sure that these systems, run efficiently, essentially, and aren't thrown out of balance, essentially creating a cycle of, a never-ending cycle of essentially a down spiral of the state in terms of, losing our precious resources?
Well, this is one area where I think a lot of the public doesn't really understand the fragility of some of our water systems. Our groundwater, of course, if it's receiving recharge, it's coming from the surface water system. That's the only place for it to come from. And the mass balance is such a fundamental concept in hydrology. You simply can't ignore it. It's like defying the law of gravity. So what happens is, if we have a decreasing surface water supply due to climate change, there are two things that happen. First of all, decreased surface water supply means decreased aquifer recharge. And at the same time, water users who were previously using surface water have to get water somewhere. So where do they go? They go to the groundwater. And so the groundwater is receiving a heavier draw from the decreased surface water supply with reduced recharge. So you get this, what we affectionately refer to as a double whammy on the aquifer, and it can very quickly spiral, as you say, sort of a death spiral.
And you know, going back to the leap ahead analysis, I mean, obviously you said that it is a bleak analysis on what the state is looking at, but you know, what can we do? What sort of recommendations have come out of that study in terms of getting us back on the right track and making sure that we're doing the right things to preserve our water for as long as we can in the most sustainable way that we can?
Well, immediately following the leap ahead analysis, the governor convened the Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force, which, instead of being a bunch of scientists and engineers, it was people who are very much involved in managing the state's water, from agencies to utilities to irrigation districts, just a very broad sampling of the people who do this for a living. And I also served on that committee, and we came up with a list of recommendations to the legislature in 2023. And one of the notable successes there was the passage of the Water Security Planning Act, which basically lays out a structured, planned schedule for developing regional water plans to cope with exactly what we're talking about here. And it is very much a bottom-up effort, where the water planning at the regional level will be done by the regional water user community. And it's just in the offing now. For the rest of this year, we'll be developing rules and guidelines for the implementation of the actual water planning effort, which will kick in next year. And this is where I cannot stress enough the need for individuals and water-related entities to participate in that process.
And Dr. King, I do want to go back to talking about the Water Security Planning Act, but I did want to ask, how responsive was the state legislature to y'all's recommendations? I mean, how much have they been able to understand, you know, how as much of a problem as you're saying this is?
Well, they certainly recognized the importance of what was going on. We also certainly didn't get everything we were asking for, particularly in terms of state investment in the process and the necessary institutional and infrastructure changes. But that's the way the legislature, you know, that's the way the democratic process works.
Mm-hmm. And so what, you know, I guess let's get into the Water Security Planning Act. What is in there, and what do you think are the most significant parts to it, you know, especially compared to what we've been doing, you know, previously?
Right, that's an excellent question. We have had 2 rounds of regional water planning in the past, and the people who are very active in the water community probably remember one or both of those. They were, I would say the first one, which was back in the early 2000s, was kind of descriptive, where, you know, talking about how the systems worked and things like that. You know, it was I thought it was a productive process, but there wasn't a whole lot of action that came out of it. And then the last go round was in the late 2010s. That one, I think a lot of people were a little fatigued from the previous round. So it really didn't produce high impact outcomes either. But the Water Security Planning Act specifically calls for implementable and implementation of recommendations in this next go round. So this is when it gets real. This is where the individual regions will be deciding, negotiating, planning how their water will be administered and managed in a future with declining supply.
And so what will that look like for the average New Mexican once those strategies do start getting implemented? I mean, how is this going to affect the average citizen?
Well, one thing is we're going to wind up living a lot more like desert people. We will, I think, inevitably have lower per capita water use. I think we will see water getting more expensive. How that is, the payment for that water is accomplished remains to be seen. But I think that water, as it becomes a more scarce resource, it will get more expensive, which will again lead people to be more conservative and thrifty with the use of their water.
And obviously, especially around southern New Mexico, the pecan industry is a big thing, and agriculture in general. How do you see this affecting the agricultural industry in terms of those crops, especially the crops that take up a lot of water, essentially?
Well, I think that as water gets more expensive, we will see generally some of the lower value crops converting their water supply to non-agricultural use. And I think some of that's inevitable. One of the things that we have always tried to stress at EBID is, number one, we've seen many places in the western United States where municipalities basically raid the agricultural water supply. They take all this land out of production, which when you no longer have a critical mass of agricultural production, you lose the support industries, the processors, the equipment dealers, the fertilizer dealers, et cetera, and your agriculture basically dries up and goes away. I don't think that's the outcome that people want to see in southern New Mexico. I think agriculture is an important part of the culture and the economy down there, and so this is where it takes regional planning to ensure that we cope with the crisis at hand, but we don't sacrifice the basic character of our communities. And so that's why this planning is so important. I'll also say that with most of those communities who go and raid the agriculture, they go through that water and they're right where they were before they raided agriculture, except they no longer have agriculture to go raid now. And so it's kicking the can down the road. We have to really look at controlling the growth and use rather than always trying to find a new place to cover your shortages.
And you talk about the Water Security Planning Act of 2023 saying not quite everything made it in that you would like. So in a perfect world, what more needs to be done on a legislative level to ensure that we're doing the best that we can for New Mexico and for our precious resource that is water?
Well, it's certainly a major challenge. I think we have to invest in. We've got a lot of our water-related infrastructure is simply not designed for its current demands, or it has years, even decades of deferred maintenance. And so one thing, the more we can shore up and improve and modernize our water infrastructure, the less agricultural land, for example, that we're going to have to take out of production, because we can actually make water through infrastructure improvements and modernization. It won't be enough. In other words, as I have said on a few occasions, we're not going to infrastructure our way out of this dilemma. It's going to take some administration developments, some capacity development in the water agencies where they really need more people, highly trained people, to carry out this growing. As the water supply shrinks, the administrative load increases as you have to do things like, priority calls or however you're going to reduce use due to critical shortage. You need the human resources to be able to do that, as well as the institutional and information infrastructure.
And Dr. King, you mentioned, not being able to, or, what's your response to folks who think we can really engineer our way out of this problem? I mean, I know there's a lot of brackish water below us and things like that. Desalination is something that individuals point to in terms of essentially engineering our way out of this crisis. What is your response to that? Do you think that could help, or do you think that's not what we should be looking at right now?
Oh, I think that we definitely need to be examining all options, and the engineering infrastructure solutions. I'm an engineer myself, so and I'm also doing some desalination work right now. Full disclosure, those sort, the high tech approach, like desal. It's true. We can make some new water from brackish water resources that were previously unusable. That is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We can add maybe a few thousand acre feet per year of desal in the lower Rio Grande to our water supply, but the systematic shortage that we're facing from climate change in basically what flows into and out of Elephant Butte Reservoir is on the order of hundreds of thousands of acre feet. So it's just different orders of magnitude. So those desal, which is, it's more expensive technology, but again, as the resource gets scarcer and more expensive, technologies that were previously unattractive due to their cost become attractive. And so that is necessary, but not sufficient.
And so since it's not sufficient, I mean, you talk about needing essentially a change in infrastructure and the way that our communities, the relationship with water, basically. So how in terms of preserving water, how much public engagement and community engagement, how important is that in terms of creating rules and making sure that everyone is getting what they need without disrupting communities on a wide scale?
Oh, it's probably the most important issue of all here. If we don't have the input and the buy-in from our communities, what happens is, instead of a planned, organized response to this crisis coming from our communities, we wind up with decades of litigation, and we don't have decades to kick the can down the road while we litigate. This is something that we have to do. We have to face the problem head on and come up with solutions that respect and are founded in local community values. Things like maintaining the agricultural nature of our lower Rio Grande.
And I could definitely see that being a challenge. What other challenges do you see in terms of implementing these processes? Because I know there's just so much that goes into this. So what is the best way to ensure that, the implementation of these laws go smoothly? I mean, because that can obviously be a big challenge, I
Sure.
understand.
Well, that hits bang on the current phase of the Strategic Water Planning Act, where the Interstate Stream Commission is developing the rules and guidelines that we will follow in the planning process. And if we are to get engagement from our water use community, the first thing they have to agree to is the rules of the game. How are we going to do this? And so that is the current effort that they're engaging in now. And I would encourage people who are interested to go and have a look. The agency is starting up a series of public meetings that'll move around the state, trying to reach, get as good coverage, good outreach, good penetration into the water use community as possible to develop the rules that we will use to plan our regional water futures.
And Dr. King, in terms of these public meetings, how important is it to ensure that, maybe historically marginalized communities or underrepresented areas of the state or communities are having a voice in the conversation and making sure that they're not being skipped over?
This is always a challenge, and certainly full inclusion is absolutely necessary. The Interstate Stream Commission is making every effort to really blanket the water using community with calls to participate in this rule and guideline formulation process. It's always a sort of a frustrating process, but I suspect that direct outreach, personal communication, just an effort even at the regional level to be inclusive of those underrepresented communities is absolutely essential to this, and certainly a major focus at achieving equity in this whole process.
And can you outline, even before this act was passed, what were some of the main challenges for the Elephant Butte Irrigation District in terms of figuring out how much water everyone needs and how they can get it, and how is the act going to change all that?
Well, the history of Elephant Butte is a long one. The dam went online in 1916, and Elephant Butte Irrigation District has a lot of history. One of the interesting facts is that in the 1980s and 1990s, we had around the 80s and 90s, we had 24 straight years of full water supply at Elephant Butte Irrigation District. Farmers had an allotment of 3 acre-feet per acre on January 1st of every year for 24 straight years. And that got to feel normal. It's not. That was the anomalous period. Since 2003, we've been up and down, mostly down in our water supply. And in 2013, we had a surface water allotment not of 3 acre-feet per acre, but 3.5 inches per acre. So we've been through some stark drought shortages in recent years. This year, the allotment is set at 1 acre-foot per acre, and that doesn't look so bad anymore. So we've certainly lowered our expectations. When a third of a full allotment doesn't look so bad anymore. Farmers tend to make up for the short surface water supply either by pumping groundwater or by fallowing ground and taking the water, what available water they do have, and concentrating on less acreage, which is taking land, at least on a seasonal basis, out of production. It's important to maintain that flexibility to bring land in to production when there's a decent water supply and take land out of production when things run short. But the district has been adaptive, and We cobbled together an agreement with the El Paso Irrigation District on the division of surface water that has maintained our farmers' access to groundwater, which is critical for to the survival of agriculture.
And Dr. King, we don't have a lot of time left, so this will be my last question. But, you do mention that this is a bleak outlook, and, people watching this interview might feel not very, might feel pessimistic after seeing it. But what can people be optimistic about looking into the future? Do you feel optimistic about the future and being able to face this issue head on?
I do feel optimistic about New Mexico's water future. I think on a global scale, things are pretty bleak. Our failure as a species to respond to climate change is disappointing. But there it is. And what New Mexico New Mexico should certainly do everything they can to minimize their contribution to climate change. But really the challenge we're faced with is adapting to a climate that's going to change regardless of what we do. And when I look at the commitment both in the state agencies, in the communities, and in a lot of the water management entities, municipal providers, irrigation districts, and things like that, I see that they are very realistic about it. They are looking to be adaptive, and I am hoping that with that mindset and a good, strong community spirit, we can move into the realities of the 21st century.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you, Dr. King, for being on our program today.
It's my pleasure.
That's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker. We'll see you next time on Fronteras, A Changing America.